Wealth often hides more than it reveals, and behind closed doors, one man's fortune became the stage for a test that would strip away appearances and expose the raw truth of the people around him. The outcome was nothing he could have predicted, a discovery that would shatter the way he saw love and loyalty. Before the story begins, make sure to subscribe, leave a like, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what you think of the plot as it unfolds. Jonathan Mercer, a white billionaire CEO, looked perfect to the world yet felt hollow inside. Surrounded by wealth, fame, and admiration, he could not escape the suspicion that people only loved what he had, not who he was. Every magazine cover, every corporate gala, every whispered compliment in elite circles reminded him of his status, but none filled the emptiness inside his chest. He had climbed from an ordinary upbringing to become one of the most powerful men in America. Yet at night, when the penthouse windows reflected only his own face back at him, he wondered if anyone truly saw the man behind the empire. 3 women orbited his life, each symbolizing a different possibility, each testing his patience in different ways. Victoria, his white girlfriend, was glamorous, blonde, and admired by everyone. She lived for the spotlight and carried herself like royalty at every event. Jonathan had once mistaken her radiance for love, but now he saw how her affection waxed and waned with the gifts he provided. When he stopped showering her with jewels or luxury trips, her smile cooled, her texts grew shorter, her tenderness vanished. Claire, his personal assistant, was razor sharp and endlessly ambitious. She knew his schedule better than he did, managed his empire with brutal efficiency, and appeared loyal. Yet Jonathan had overheard her one night at a company gala tell a friend that if she played her cards right, she might become Mrs. Mercer. That sentence had lingered in his mind like an oil stain, revealing her ambition not to stand beside him as a partner, but to climb her way into the position of power his name represented. Then there was Evelyn, his black maid, quiet and humble, who carried herself with a dignity that unsettled him. She never asked for raises or favors, never lingered in rooms where she wasn't needed, and when Jonathan once overheard her speaking softly on the phone about her mother's surgery, he stepped in and offered to cover all costs. Evelyn refused with a strength that startled him, saying, "It's not your responsibility, sir. I'll manage." Who refused help so firmly? Who turned away a billionaire's offer when it could solve a problem instantly? That moment had planted a seed in his mind. Evelyn was unlike anyone else around him. Jonathan's success had turned every relationship into a transaction, and he was tired of being treated like a vault with legs. He thought often of his mother's words before she passed away: "Marry a woman who builds, not just one who shines. Gold can be polished, but foundations must be strong." Those words haunted him in the silence of his nights, echoing in the empty halls of his mansion. He wondered if he had surrounded himself only with polish and shine while missing the strength he truly needed. That morning, Jonathan received a text from Victoria, who was traveling in Paris. She sent him a selfie, lips pursed, heart emojis filling the screen, bragging about her new designer handbag. He didn't respond. He didn't feel missed, only measured. Claire entered his study shortly after, tablet in hand, prepared to brief him on meetings, acquisitions, and contracts. He interrupted her briskly, telling her to clear his schedule for the entire week. Claire blinked, shocked, but did as instructed, though Jonathan saw the flicker of calculation in her eyes. Later, Evelyn entered quietly to tell him the car was ready. She stood in her neat gray uniform, her hair tied back simply, her eyes lowered in deference. She said nothing more than what was necessary, and somehow it was her silence that lingered with him the longest. Jonathan sat alone in his study that evening, a glass of scotch in his hand, the brass desk lamp casting golden light over the oak. He picked up a legal pad and wrote down 3 names: Victoria, Claire, Evelyn. 3 women, 3 possibilities. His pen tapped rhythmically as the idea forming in his mind solidified. What if he stripped away the performance? What if he gave them freedom, unlimited wealth, no rules, no boundaries, and simply watched what they did? It would not be a trap, not a trick, but clarity. It would show him who they were when they believed no one was watching. He called James, his head of private security, and gave precise instructions. 3 cards, 3 days, track the spending, track the choices, but no invasions of private space. The following morning, Jonathan Mercer awoke earlier than usual, his mind still circling the decision he had made the night before, the 3 envelopes lying in his study like silent witnesses to the test he was about to begin. And as he dressed in a gray suit without a tie and sipped his black coffee, he rehearsed the first step in his mind, the handing over of the card to Victoria, the woman who in so many ways embodied the life everyone envied, but whom he increasingly suspected embodied nothing that could be trusted. And when his driver pulled up to the helipad atop Mercer Tower, where Victoria's chauffeured black SUV had just arrived, Jonathan straightened his shoulders and forced his face into calm neutrality. Victoria stepped out in a gleaming white designer jumpsuit, platinum hair catching the morning sun like strands of glass, her phone in her manicured hand as she greeted him with a bright "Darling, finally, you've been so distant," before kissing his cheek, her perfume overwhelming in its intensity, and he offered a polite smile, though it did not touch his eyes. She held up her new crocodile skin handbag as though to remind him of the expense she had just indulged in overseas, remarking with a pout that he had not commented on it yet, and he simply said, "It's nice," with flat detachment before slipping his hand into his coat and withdrawing the black envelope with her name inscribed. He handed it to her and watched her eyes widen, first in disbelief, then in delight as she opened it and saw the unmarked black card inside. "What's this?" she asked breathlessly, her tone already rich with anticipation, and he said calmly, "A gift, 3 days, no rules. Spend it however you want." Her laugh erupted high-pitched and giddy as she clutched his arm and squealed that he was the best, promising to make him proud, and before he could even form another sentence, she was dialing her best friend, rushing back into her SUV, shouting excited plans, her vehicle already pulling away from the helipad while Jonathan stood still, the tightness in his chest returning. He had given her an opportunity not for performance, but for truth, and she had not even asked why, had not even paused to consider him, only the possibilities of excess that had suddenly opened before her. That evening, Jonathan sat in his study with the reports beginning to arrive from James, his security chief, the receipts streaming in one after another, and the story they told was not one of love or gratitude, but of appetite. Within hours of receiving the card, Victoria had booked a private appointment at the Gilded Swan, one of the most exclusive boutiques in the city, where champagne had been poured into crystal flutes as she swept through racks of clothing, pointing at items without glancing at their prices, her friends recording videos for social media as staff scrambled to serve her. Her Instagram stories appeared soon after, hashtags boasting, "treat yourself," "spoiled," "rich life," her phone full of self-celebrations as if the gift had been granted for her performance rather than to expose her values. By lunchtime, she was seated at La Vie, a rooftop restaurant renowned for its opulence, joined by 4 of her influencer friends, ordering bottles of wine, lobster risotto, steak tartare, and desserts in quantities absurd for the table, the bill totaling over $2,000, and Jonathan, reading the report, felt his stomach clench at the note that one of the women mocked a waitress for her accent, with Victoria laughing and filming it. The receipts continued to pour in that evening. Jewelry stores, designer handbags, a $6,000 diamond anklet, reservations for a yacht party scheduled for the following day with nearly 50 guests, none of whom Jonathan had ever met, all of it broadcast for her followers with carefully curated captions. In less than 24 hours, she had spent over $32,000, and she had not sent Jonathan a single message of thanks, not a word of affection, not even an invitation to join her. She was lost in the gleam of her own reflection, using his wealth not as a gesture of intimacy, but as a platform for display, and Jonathan sat alone in the dim study with his scotch untouched, the emptiness inside him growing heavier. He thought again of his mother's words, of foundations and polish, and could see clearly that Victoria was polished to a blinding shine, a surface with no depth beneath it. Still, he kept the reports. Still, he read each one, because he knew the experiment could not be judged on a single subject, because there were 2 more women to test, and only in the contrast would the truth finally emerge. Jonathan sat in his study late into the night, the reports of Victoria's indulgence still lying across his desk like open wounds, the receipts shouting not only her greed, but also her disregard for dignity, And though the sting of betrayal was sharp, he knew the experiment had only begun because there were still 2 more women whose choices had yet to be revealed. And so when morning arrived, he prepared himself to face Claire, the assistant who had stood at his side for 5 years, sharp-witted and reliable, ambitious yet loyal in appearance, and he wondered whether she would prove to be as hollow as Victoria or if she might reveal a different kind of truth. Claire arrived at the office punctually as always, her red heels striking the polished marble floor with confidence, a sleek navy suit framing her figure, her dark hair pulled back neatly, and a tablet in her hand loaded with numbers and strategies for the week ahead. She entered Jonathan's office briskly, speaking before the door had even closed. "I've cleared your schedule as you asked. The quarterly report is finalized, and your call with the investors has been pushed to Monday." Jonathan nodded, accepting the tablet from her, and then without ceremony, he reached into his desk drawer, removed the second black envelope, and handed it across the desk. Claire stopped mid-sentence, her expression sharpening as she took the envelope with cautious fingers. "What's this?" she asked, her eyes narrowing slightly. "A gift," Jonathan replied with calm detachment. 3 days, no limits. Use it however you want." Claire hesitated, her professional mask faltering for a split second before her practiced smile returned, polished and deliberate, the kind of smile she often used when closing deals on his behalf. "That's generous," she said, her voice carrying a note of restrained excitement. Jonathan watched her carefully, noting how her eyes flicked downward to the card inside, her fingers brushing over it like someone weighing not its material but its potential, and he knew already that Claire's game would be different from Victoria's. She would not flaunt her access with champagne bottles and yacht parties. No, Claire's ambition was of a colder variety. She would use the card not to shine, but to climb. Within hours, James sent Jonathan the first updates. Claire had checked into a 5-star resort downtown, reserving a luxury suite under her own name, a calculated move not to hide, but to establish independence. She booked spa treatments, massages, and a wine-paired dinner, not out of frivolous indulgence, but to maintain the aura of someone important, someone who belonged in those rooms. The purchases came next, measured and precise. Designer heels that spoke of authority, a tailored cocktail dress from an exclusive boutique, and a limited edition perfume. Unlike Victoria, who grabbed everything that glittered, Claire was crafting an image brick by brick. By late afternoon, the report showed her at a rooftop cocktail mixer known for its guest list of executives and investors. Surveillance photos captured her seated at a table with 3 senior managers from companies that had been circling Mercer Industries for acquisition talks. She leaned forward, her smile poised, her gestures confident. James's note read, she introduced herself as Jonathan Mercer's closest advisor, played heavily on her proximity to you. Jonathan sat back in his chair as he read those words, the glass of scotch warming in his hand. This was not spending, this was strategy. Claire was investing in her future, leveraging his name, his power, his empire, as if it were her ladder to climb out of the shadow he provided. He had expected as much, yet seeing it spelled out so plainly cut deep. That evening, Claire posted on her professional social media a polished photo of herself in the cocktail dress with a caption, "Success is about the rooms you walk into and who is waiting at the table. Always come prepared. Strategy, leadership, women in power." Jonathan read the words 3 times, each repetition colder than the last, because it was not gratitude, not acknowledgement, not even subtle loyalty. It was performance, ambition clothed as empowerment, her hands stretching for doors she could only reach by presenting herself as his equal. He thought back to conversations he had with her late at night after board meetings when she had spoken about opportunity, about vision, about making her mark. He had admired her fire once, but now he saw how easily that fire could consume everything in its path, including him. By the end of the second day, the report showed Claire expanding her network further. She had arranged private lunches with 2 venture capitalists, ordered business cards with her name embossed beside the words, "Senior Advisor to Jonathan Mercer," and used the card to sponsor an elite networking brunch. She wasn't spending for pleasure. She was building a platform, a launch pad. Jonathan closed the laptop with a grim sigh, understanding that while Victoria had revealed vanity, Claire had revealed ambition of a sharper, more dangerous kind. She had not wasted the card on dresses and jewelry, though she bought them too, but every purchase was a brick in a facade she was erecting for herself, a future where she could step out from behind him and claim credit as though his empire were hers. Jonathan awoke the next morning with the lingering bitterness of Claire's choices still sitting in his chest, the images of her shaking hands with his rivals, her careful captions on social media boasting of strategy and power, a gnawing reminder that even those who stood closest to him in business did not see him as a man, but as a platform. And though he had expected as much, it still hollowed him out further, leaving him anxious for the final envelope, the one addressed to Evelyn, the quiet black maid who had never once asked him for anything, never lingered in his office to seek favors, never angled herself to appear more important than she was. And as he walked into the kitchen that morning, the envelope sat waiting for her beside her usual task list, his handwriting on the note. "This is for you, Evelyn, no strings. Spend it however you want. You deserve it. J." She entered the room soon after, her gray uniform pressed, her hair tied back neatly, her dark eyes lowering in surprise as she picked up the envelope and turned it over slowly in her hands, her brows knitting together with unease. She carried it carefully to his study and knocked lightly, hesitant, before stepping inside when he called. "Mr. Mercer," she began, her voice low but steady, "I think this was left by mistake." Jonathan looked up from his desk, his expression calm, and shook his head. "No mistake, it's for you." Evelyn blinked rapidly, clutching the envelope to her chest as though it might burn her fingers. "But sir, I don't understand. Did I do something wrong?" He chuckled softly, shaking his head again. "No, Evelyn, you've done everything right. I just wanted to say thank you. You work hard, take a few days, do something for yourself." She shifted nervously, her shoulders tightening. "I don't need anything, sir. My needs are met." Jonathan leaned back in his chair, studying her closely. "I know, but just take it. You have 3 days. Go live a little." Their eyes met for the briefest moment, hers filled with hesitation and something deeper fear perhaps, or humility, and then she nodded slowly. "All right, thank you," she said, her voice almost apologetic before turning and slipping out of the study as quietly as she had entered. Jonathan sat watching the door long after it closed, struck by her reluctance, her refusal to see the card as opportunity, seeing it instead as burden. That alone already told him more than all the receipts of the past 2 days. By evening, James called with the first updates. His tone was different this time, quieter, almost respectful. "Sir, Evelyn used the card today, but not in the way you might expect. She bought groceries, paid 2 months' rent on her apartment, gave a cash donation to a local orphanage, and purchased 4 takeout meals which she handed out to homeless men on 8th Street. Jonathan's throat tightened as he listened, his hand frozen on the tumbler of scotch. "She didn't use the full card?" he asked. James replied, "She's barely touched 1%. When the call ended, Jonathan sat motionless in the dim light of his study, staring at the silver-framed photo of his parents on the desk. He thought of his mother's words again about foundations versus polish, about building rather than shining, and realized that Evelyn had done what neither Victoria nor Claire could imagine. She had taken wealth placed in her hands and immediately used it to lift others rather than herself. No hashtags, no gowns, no yachts. Just quiet compassion extended without fanfare. The following morning, the reports continued, showing Evelyn at a small corner grocery near her apartment, not an organic market, not a gourmet boutique, but a modest neighborhood store. She filled her cart with rice, beans, canned goods, bread, diapers, baby formula, and a bouquet of daisies. The receipt totaled less than $90. Later, she walked to her apartment building, dropped off some items, then re-emerged with 2 canvas bags and made her way to a hospital where she spoke softly with the nurse at the front desk. After some discussion, she handed over the card to pay for a neighbor's chemotherapy bill. There were no photos, no announcements, no evidence of performance, only the quiet gesture of a woman who believed helping someone else mattered more than buying herself comfort. Later that day, she stopped at the old stone orphanage on 6th Street, a crumbling building Jonathan remembered driving past for years without thought. Evelyn carried inside books, art supplies, and bags of fruit. Hours later, a surveillance photo arrived showing her sitting on the floor cross-legged, 3 children clustered around her, one asleep against her shoulder as she gently patted his back. The sight struck Jonathan harder than all the other reports combined. Evelyn didn't know she was being watched, didn't know her choices were being recorded, and yet what she revealed in that unguarded moment was more powerful than anything Victoria or Claire had shown with all their wealth. Jonathan spent the night restless, unable to dismiss from his mind the images James had shared of Evelyn sitting on the orphanage floor surrounded by children, her simple grocery bags on the ground, her quiet smile imposed, uncalculated, a moment of sincerity that contrasted so violently with the extravagance of Victoria's yacht party and the polished ambition of Claire's networking brunch. And as dawn crept into the penthouse, Jonathan felt a mix of anticipation and dread for the full reports James promised to deliver, knowing that the truth he had demanded was now arriving and there would be no way to hide from it. He sat at his desk with his coffee black and bitter, the screen of his laptop glowing with spreadsheets, itemized purchases, and surveillance stills, each receipt a window into the hearts of the 3 women he had chosen to test. The first folder bore Victoria's name, and as he clicked it, opened the story unfolded with painful predictability. From the moment she received the card, she had been intoxicated with indulgence, shopping at boutiques where staff followed her with armfuls of clothing, posting endless stories on social media under hashtags like spoiled, blessed, rich life, her face lit not with gratitude but with pride. By midday, she was dining at La Vie with 4 influencer friends, the bill surpassing $2,000, bottles of expensive wine cluttering the table, laughter spilling out as one of them mocked the waitress's accent while Victoria filmed and laughed along. The receipts spiraled further into excess. Multiple jewelry stores, 2 designer handbags, a $6,000 diamond anklet, and finally the rental of a yacht for a white party, nearly 50 strangers on the guest list. Not once has she called Jonathan, not once has she thanked him, not once has she even asked if he might join her. To her, the card was not a test or a gift, but a stage for vanity, and Jonathan closed the folder with a hollow ache pressing down on his chest. He opened the second folder, Claire's, and the ache turned into something sharper. Her purchases were precise, deliberate, the actions of someone shaping not joy, but strategy. She had checked into a luxury suite at a downtown resort, her name boldly on the reservation, and scheduled spa treatments and fittings not as frivolities, but as tools to construct an image. Her receipts included a tailored cocktail dress, professional-grade business cards listing her as senior advisor to Jonathan Mercer, and sponsorship of a brunch attended by venture capitalists and executives. Surveillance stills captured her at a rooftop mixer leaning forward across a table with 3 senior managers from rival firms, her smile poised, her confidence evident, presenting herself as his partner without hesitation. Later, she posted on LinkedIn about the importance of walking into the right rooms with the right people, her hashtags boasting strategy, leadership, women in power, as if Jonathan's empire were her own springboard. The report was clean, professional, even admirable in its discipline, yet to Jonathan, it was more cutting than Victoria's recklessness. Vanity was easy to recognize, but ambition disguised as loyalty was more dangerous, a betrayal carried out not in glitter, but in calculation. He pushed the laptop away, the glass of scotch beside him untouched, his reflection in the window staring back with weary eyes. Hours passed before he opened the final folder, Evelyn's, his hand trembling slightly as he clicked. The first images were almost surreal in their simplicity. Evelyn standing in line at a neighborhood market, her cart filled with rice, beans, bread, diapers, formula, and a bouquet of daisies. The receipt showed less than $90 spent. Another photo captured her walking to her modest brick apartment building, then leaving moments later carrying bags toward a nearby hospital where she spoke with a nurse before paying off a bill later confirmed to be for a neighbor's chemotherapy treatments. There were no announcements, no posts, no evidence of her seeking recognition. The next series showed her entering the worn gates of the 6th Street orphanage, arms filled with art supplies and fruit, later kneeling on the floor reading to children, one small boy asleep against her shoulder. The report ended with a note, total spending under $100, balance untouched. Jonathan sat frozen as he stared at the images, his throat tightening until it was difficult to swallow. While Victoria had used the card to inflate her ego, and Claire had used it to elevate her position, Evelyn had used it to ease burdens that were not her own, to feed, to comfort, to heal. She had treated the card not as a right, but as a responsibility, a chance to serve rather than to consume, and it shook him more deeply than he could admit. Jonathan spent the entire next day preparing himself for the inevitable confrontation, the weight of the receipts and surveillance stills pressing heavily on his conscience, each document serving as undeniable proof of the truth he had demanded to see, and he knew there was no going back to comfortable illusions or polite pretenses, no way to pretend he did not know the reality of the women who surrounded him, so he arranged a dinner at his mansion that evening, a dinner meant not for celebration but for revelation. The dining room was prepared meticulously, the long walnut table polished until it gleamed beneath the chandelier, 6 places set, though only 4 would be filled, crystal glasses catching the light, silverware aligned with military precision, the kind of dinner setting that once would have been used to impress investors or dignitaries, but tonight would serve as a stage for unveiling the masks that had already slipped. Jonathan dressed in a charcoal gray suit without a tie, his collar unbuttoned, his face calm though inside a storm raged, and as the women arrived one by one, he measured their expressions carefully. Victoria entered first, wearing a fitted red dress that shimmered with each movement, her makeup flawless, her eyes already bored as though she were enduring a formality rather than attending an important conversation. Claire arrived shortly after in a sharp black pantsuit, her posture straight, her silver brooch catching the chandelier's light, her demeanor poised and calculating, prepared for whatever she thought Jonathan intended to announce. Evelyn was the last to arrive, dressed in a soft cream blouse and a long floral skirt, her hands folded nervously in her lap as she sat, clearly uncomfortable, out of place in a room designed for power and spectacle. The 4th chair remained empty, and Jonathan had intentionally invited no one else. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, until Victoria broke it with a sigh, twirling her wine glass between her manicured fingers. "So," she said, her tone light but laced with irritation, "what's the occasion? You said this was important." Jonathan's eyes rested on her evenly. "Yes," he said, his voice measured. "It Island." Claire leaned forward slightly, her eyes sharp with curiosity. "Are we celebrating something?" Jonathan folded his hands on the table, his expression unreadable. "In a way, we're celebrating honesty." Victoria smirked, rolling her eyes. "Sounds serious." Jonathan held her gaze for a long, heavy moment. "It Island," he let the silence stretch again before continuing. "3 days ago, I gave each of you a card. No rules, no limits. I told you it was a gift, and in a way it was. But it was also a test." The words hung in the air like smoke, and the room fell completely still. Victoria's smile faltered, her eyes narrowing. Claire tilted her head slightly, suspicion flickering across her face. Evelyn's breath caught, her body tensing as though bracing for dismissal. Jonathan's tone remained calm. "I needed to know the truth. Not from what you told me, but from what you did when you thought no one was watching." Victoria scoffed, her tone sharpening. "What the hell does that mean? You spied on us?" Jonathan's expression did not change. "It means I watched. I listened. I learned." He turned to her first, his voice cutting through the silence. "You spent $86,000 in 3 days. You bought designer shoes in 5 different colors, you tipped a valet $500 and then mocked him by calling him a peasant, and you laughed when your friend ridiculed a waitress for her accent. You didn't once thank me. You didn't once call me. You used the car to feed your ego." Victoria's face flushed red as she shoved her chair back, clutching her clutch purse tightly. "Unbelievable, you're sick." "You set me up." Jonathan's voice was cool, steady. "No, you exposed yourself." She glared at him, waiting for an apology that never came, then stormed out of the room, her heels striking the marble floor like gunshots, the door slamming behind her. The room remained silent, the tension thick enough to choke on. Claire exhaled slowly, her composure intact, though her eyes sharpened like blades. Jonathan turned to her, his tone unflinching. "You were different, Claire. You didn't throw parties, you didn't waste money, but you used the car to elevate yourself. You attended mixers with executives I've never introduced you to. You presented yourself as my partner, my closest advisor, when you are not. You used my name as currency to open doors for yourself. Claire's eyes narrowed further, her voice tense. So ambition is a crime now? Jonathan shook his head slowly. No, but Deception Island. And you weren't investing in us. You were investing in your exit strategy. Claire's lips thinned, her hands tightening on her glass. I gave you 5 years of my life, Jonathan. I worked around the clock. I cleaned up your mistakes. I saved you from scandals. And this is how you repay me? With an interrogation? Jonathan's gaze was steady. Loyalty doesn't give you license to manipulate. You weren't building with me. You were climbing over me. Claire rose gracefully, adjusting her blazer with deliberate dignity. I see what this is, she said coldly. You've decided she's the saint, and she tilted her head toward Evelyn, whose eyes widened in alarm. The maid with the golden heart. This is your twisted Cinderella fantasy. Evelyn froze, her hands trembling slightly. Jonathan began to speak, but Claire cut him off with a bitter smile. No, it's fine. Good luck with your little experiment. With that, she walked out, her exit quieter than Victoria's, but no less final, the door closing with a weight that echoed through the silence. Jonathan remained seated at the long walnut table after Claire's departure, the chandelier above still glowing, but the room around him thick with silence, the echo of Victoria's heels and Claire's icy words still lingering in the air. Yet opposite him, Evelyn sat frozen in her chair, her cream blouse and floral skirt making her seem even more out of place now that the others were gone, and her trembling hands in her lap betrayed her fear that this confrontation might end with her dismissal. Jonathan leaned forward, softening his tone to break the tension. You have nothing to fear, Evelyn, he said quietly, his eyes steady on hers. She shook her head faintly, her voice catching as she whispered, I thought maybe this was goodbye. Jonathan's heart clenched at the admission, realizing how invisible she had felt in this house, how easily she assumed that any spotlight might be the moment she was cast aside. No, he said. It was never a goodbye. It was a beginning. She blinked rapidly, her lips parting as though she could not quite believe him. Jonathan drew a slow breath and continued, I saw what you did with the card. I saw you buy groceries and pay rent. I saw you help your neighbor with hospital bills. I saw you with those children reading to them on the floor of an orphanage that no one else cared to visit. And you didn't do it for attention or recognition. You didn't even know I was watching. You gave because that's who you are. Evelyn's cheeks flushed with embarrassment, her eyes lowering again. I didn't think of it as my money, she admitted. It felt wrong to use it for myself. I just thought if I had this chance, maybe I should use it to help someone else. Jonathan leaned back, struck by her honesty. That's what makes you different, he said softly. You don't take, you give. Not to impress, not to climb, but because you cannot stand by and do nothing. Evelyn twisted her fingers nervously, whispering, I was just trying to be decent. Jonathan's voice grew more earnest. The world doesn't need more decent people, Evelyn. It needs more of you. For the first time that evening, she looked up and held his gaze, her dark eyes wide, shining with uncertainty yet unflinching. They sat in silence for a long moment, the kind of silence that says more than words, before she finally asked, her voice trembling, Why are you really here, Mr. Mercer? He hesitated, then replied, Please, call me Jonathan. She nodded slightly, and he continued, his voice heavy with years of unspoken truth. I'm tired of pretending. I'm tired of being with people who only see my bank account, my name, my empire, and when I look at you, I see something else. I see peace. I see honesty. I see someone who doesn't want anything from me except maybe to be seen back. Evelyn swallowed hard, her breath catching. I'm afraid, she confessed. I'm just me. I don't know your world. I don't know how to be what you're used to. Jonathan smiled faintly, leaning forward, his tone firm but tender. Good. Because what I've been used to has never made me feel anything real. He stood suddenly, the scrape of the chair loud against the marble, and gestured toward the hallway. Come, he said. Evelyn rose reluctantly, her movements hesitant as she followed him through the mansion. They walked past the grand staircase and down the corridor toward the servants' quarters, a place Jonathan had rarely entered, not because he disdained it, but because he had never considered that it might hold significance. He stopped outside her door and knocked softly. When she opened it, she stood in plain cotton pajamas, her hair loosened, her face bare of makeup, looking younger, vulnerable, and more real than ever. She stepped aside to let him in, and he entered her modest room, taking in the small bookshelf filled with worn novels, the framed photograph of an older woman he assumed was her mother, the vase of daisies she had bought earlier, now placed neatly on her desk. It was a room of dignity without wealth, of care without extravagance, and Jonathan felt oddly at peace, standing within it. "You keep it beautiful here," he said softly. Evelyn gave a small, shy smile. "It's the only space that's really mine." Jonathan sat gently on the edge of the love seat near the window, gesturing for her to take the chair by the desk. "I owe you an apology," he began. She frowned slightly. "For what?" "For dragging you into this. For turning your kindness into an experiment. For watching you as if you were a subject instead of a person. I was trying to protect myself, but I ended up using people, even the good ones." Evelyn shook her head, her voice firm despite its softness. "I don't blame you. You live surrounded by people who want what you have, not who you are." "That must be exhausting." Jonathan let out a bitter laugh. "You have no idea." They sat in silence for a moment before Evelyn spoke again. "You asked me why I didn't use the card for myself. The truth is, I thought about it. I thought about buying a real dress, something beautiful. I've never owned anything like that. I imagined walking into a store and choosing something just because I could. But then I saw my neighbor struggling to pay for her daughter's medicine, and I saw an old man with a sign asking to be warm for just one night, and I couldn't ignore them. Not when I had the chance to help." Jonathan felt something shift deep inside him, as though a door long locked had quietly opened. "No one's ever said that to me," he murmured. Evelyn tilted her head. "What do you mean?" Jonathan stood and walked to the window, his voice low. "I built everything from the ground up, every company, every dollar, every opportunity, but not once in my life has someone told me that I mattered for who I am, only for what I could give, for what I could buy. And you, Evelyn, you did all that for strangers with no expectation, no spotlight, no applause, just because you could." Evelyn's eyes dropped, her voice hushed. "That's how my mother raised me. We didn't have much, but she always said kindness doesn't need a reason, it just needs a heart willing to give." Jonathan turned, stepping closer, his voice breaking slightly. "And you have that heart, Evelyn." She looked up at him then, and in the silence between them, something unspoken passed, fragile but undeniable, an understanding that went beyond words or roles, beyond wealth or station. It wasn't romance yet, but it was the first breath of it, the first real connection Jonathan had felt in years. Outside, the wind stirred through the trees and rain began tapping gently against the glass. Inside, two people stood together in the modest room of a maid. Yet for Jonathan, it felt more real than any ballroom, more profound than any gala, because here at last, he was seen not as a billionaire, not as a trophy, not as a prize, but as a man. Jonathan left Evelyn's modest room that night with a heaviness in his chest, not the heaviness of despair that had accompanied Victoria's vanity or Claire's ambition, but the weight of realization that something in his life had shifted permanently, that the truth he had sought in the quiet surveillance reports was no longer confined to receipts or photographs, but was now standing before him in the form of a woman who had chosen compassion when she could have chosen indulgence. And as he walked the hallways of his mansion, he found the silence no longer unbearable but contemplative, because he knew he could not go back to living surrounded by glittering illusions and polished masks. The following morning, he canceled meetings again, ignoring the flashing notifications from executives demanding his attention, and instead, he walked into the kitchen where Evelyn was tidying up. She looked startled to see him so early, and even more startled when he told her, "You're coming with me today." She hesitated, hands frozen on the dish towel, but Jonathan insisted with a calm firmness that allowed no argument. "I want you beside me," he said, "not as my maid, but as someone who deserves to be seen." Later that day, Jonathan arrived at a private investor luncheon held in a marble-floored art gallery downtown, the walls lined with abstract paintings and the table set with cold shrimp cocktails and overpriced wine. He entered without his usual entourage of security or advisors, only Evelyn walking beside him, her modest cream blouse freshly pressed, her dark hair pulled back simply, her steps measured and uncertain. The room reacted subtly, as rooms of the wealthy always do. Quick glances, whispered questions, polite but forced smiles. Some of the attendees recognized her as the maid from Jonathan's home, others assumed she was a new hire, but their stares carried an edge of disdain, the kind reserved for those who did not belong. Jonathan noticed a shift in the air, the way the conversations faltered momentarily before resuming, and he leaned slightly toward Evelyn. "Keep your head high," he whispered. "You don't owe anyone here anything." She nodded, swallowing her nerves, and walked with him to the table. The luncheon began with polite chatter about markets, mergers, and private equity structures. Evelyn remained quiet at first, only answering when someone addressed her directly, but when the conversation shifted toward philanthropy and one of the investors made a dismissive remark about social programs being wasted on people who can't help themselves, Evelyn spoke up. Her voice was soft but steady as she described the literacy programs she had been helping to fund at the orphanage, the meals she wanted to expand for children who went hungry after school, and the way even small investments in dignity could change lives. Her words were simple, free of jargon, yet the table fell silent as she spoke, her sincerity impossible to ignore. She didn't posture, she didn't sell, she didn't rehearse lines about return on investment. She spoke with conviction born of experience, and Jonathan, watching her, felt a surge of pride unlike anything he had felt at business victories. For the first time in years, he saw people listen not because of his wealth, but because of her authenticity. After the luncheon ended and they were driven home, Evelyn slumped in the back seat, exhaling heavily. "I was terrified," she admitted, her hands twisting in her lap. Jonathan smiled gently. "You didn't show it. You belonged there more than anyone." She shook her head. "I didn't understand half of what they were talking about." He reached over and took her hand softly. "You didn't need to. They needed to hear what you said, not what they already know." Evelyn stared out the window, her reflection in the glass uncertain, but inside her heart she felt a new possibility stirring. In the weeks that followed, Jonathan deliberately changed the rhythm of his life. The staff in the mansion was reduced by half, not fired but reassigned with better hours and more humane conditions. The endless stream of catered dinners and stage galas replaced by simple meals, often just takeout or the home cooking Evelyn prepared because she enjoyed it, not because she was obligated. Jonathan insisted Evelyn meet with an advisor he trusted, not to transform her into someone else, but to give her tools, basic accounting, business literacy, leadership, mentorship. At first, she resisted, uncomfortable with the idea of being treated as more than what she had always been, but Jonathan persisted, telling her, "You're already a leader, Evelyn. I'm just giving you better tools." Gradually, she began to step into the role, not because she sought recognition, but because she realized the foundation he had established could be used for more than profit. It could be used to create change. Every afternoon, she spent hours at the shelter where she had once volunteered. Only now she was not folding laundry or sweeping floors, but managing budgets, hiring staff, and organizing services. She directed resources to schools, to food programs, to safe housing, each decision made with the same quiet conviction she had shown at the luncheon. Jonathan often accompanied her, not as the billionaire owner of the foundation, but as her partner, carrying boxes, planting herbs in the garden she started at the mansion, even painting walls in the orphanage she refused to abandon. Their evenings were spent in simple companionship, eating together at the long dining table that now bore mismatched chairs filled with neighbors, former employees, and children from the programs Evelyn supported. They read together in his study, now equipped with a second reading chair, and sometimes laughed so hard over shared stories that Jonathan's eyes filled with tears. One morning after a storm had passed overnight, Jonathan found himself standing beneath the dripping pergola in the garden, the dawn breaking over the wet cobblestones, and Evelyn stepped beside him with 2 mugs of coffee. "What are you thinking?" she asked gently. Jonathan stared at the horizon, his voice quiet. "I used to want to be remembered for building an empire. Now I just want to be remembered by the person I chose to build with." Evelyn looked down shyly, murmuring, "I'm not easy to build with. I get scared. I doubt myself." Jonathan turned toward her, smiling softly. "Good. Doubt keeps us honest. Fear keeps us humble." She raised her eyes to him. "And what keeps us going?" He reached out, touching her cheek with tenderness. "Love," he said, "but not the kind people sell on magazine covers. The kind you grow in small moments. The kind that shows up even when no one is looking." Evelyn leaned into his touch, her eyes glistening, and for the first time since she had entered his world as a maid, she no longer felt out of place. She felt like a partner, Jonathan had never imagined that the echoing marble halls of his mansion could feel like a home, yet in the weeks that followed his decision to bring Evelyn closer into his world, he began to witness a transformation not of walls or decor, but of atmosphere, as though the spirit of the place had shifted, the cold grandeur softening into warmth simply because one person chose to inhabit it with sincerity. The staff no longer bustled with the frantic energy of maintaining appearances for socialites or investors, but instead moved with calmer rhythms, grateful for shorter hours and fairer treatment. The dining room, once a stage for gala performances and stiffly rehearsed dinners, now rang with the laughter of neighbors, children, and colleagues who shared mismatched chairs around a long handmade wooden table Evelyn had insisted on replacing the formal one with. The study, once Jonathan's sanctuary of solitude, now bore 2 reading chairs, her books stacked beside his, their presence a quiet reminder that companionship did not require noise to be meaningful. For Jonathan, these small details carried more significance than all the awards he had ever won, because they represented the difference between a house and a home. Evelyn herself was changing too, though she remained as humble as when she had first held the black envelope with trembling fingers. With the mentorship Jonathan had arranged, she began to understand budgets, logistics, and leadership strategies, not because she wanted to impress investors or dress in power suits, but because she wanted to direct resources where they mattered most. At the community shelter, she once swept floors, she now coordinated staff schedules and balanced ledgers, ensuring money was stretched far enough to feed more mouths and clothe more bodies. At the orphanage she once donated groceries, she now organized after-school programs, hiring tutors and arranging art lessons for children who had never held a paintbrush before. Jonathan often accompanied her, rolling up his sleeves to carry boxes of supplies or paint the crumbling walls, his expensive suits replaced by rolled-up shirts and calloused hands. The media, when they caught sight of him at such places, tried to spin it as a calculated rebranding of a billionaire's image, but Jonathan ignored the headlines entirely. He knew the truth, and the truth was simpler. He was not performing, he was participating in Evelyn's vision. Their bond deepened through shared work, but also through shared quiet. Evenings became rituals of companionship, meals eaten side by side, sometimes elaborate when Evelyn felt like cooking, sometimes as simple as takeout cartons left on the kitchen island. They debated ideas, what programs mattered most, how to expand without losing integrity, and sometimes they sat in silence, reading or watching the fire crackle, the comfort of presence replacing the emptiness Jonathan had once drowned in scotch. On weekends, Evelyn dragged him into the garden, insisting they plant herbs and vegetables, laughing at his clumsy attempts at digging. The soil stained his manicured hands, but he found himself enjoying it. The simple act of cultivating life far more fulfilling than any acquisition deal he had ever signed. It was in those moments, watching her crouch in the dirt with determination and joy, that he realized how much she had taught him without ever intending to. That wealth meant nothing unless it was grounded in purpose. That love meant nothing unless it was rooted in truth. One evening, after a long day of meetings and shelter visits, Jonathan found Evelyn standing in the hallway staring at a painting that had hung there for years, an abstract piece purchased at an auction for no reason other than prestige. "I never understood this," she admitted softly, tilting her head. "It feels empty." Jonathan looked at the canvas, the swirls of meaningless color, and realized she was right. The next day he had it removed and replaced with photographs of the programs Evelyn had nurtured, the children at the orphanage holding up their artwork, the women at the shelter smiling as they unpacked supplies, the volunteers planting a community garden. For the first time, his walls reflected not wealth, but impact. Evelyn blushed when she saw them, murmuring that it felt strange to take up space in his world, but Jonathan replied firmly, "It's our world now, not just mine." The media attempted again to intrude, first with whispers of scandal claims that Jonathan had abandoned a glamorous girlfriend and an ambitious assistant for a Cinderella story with his maid, but Evelyn refused all interviews and Jonathan remained silent and without drama to feed on the story eventually withered. Inside their walls, they paid no attention to the tabloids. Their focus remained on the work and on each other. When Evelyn doubted herself, worrying she was unqualified to lead, Jonathan reminded her gently that her instinct for compassion was more powerful than any degree. When Jonathan grew weary of the constant demands of his empire, Evelyn reminded him that his wealth was not his burden but his tool, and together they redirected it to places that mattered. In those exchanges, they built trust, the kind that could not be purchased or faked, and Jonathan began to see their future not as a question mark, but as a foundation in progress. One crisp morning, as autumn leaves scattered across the mansion grounds, Jonathan found Evelyn kneeling in the garden tying stakes for the tomato plants they had planted together. He walked toward her with coffee in hand and asked, "What keeps us going?" She looked up at him, sweat glistening on her brow, and said, "Hope, and the people we carry with us." Jonathan smiled, crouching beside her, his hand brushing hers. "And love," he added softly. "Not the kind sold on magazine covers, but the kind that grows here." She nodded, her eyes glistening, and for a moment the world outside ceased to exist. Together, they began planning larger projects, transforming one wing of the mansion into a learning center, another into temporary housing for women escaping abuse. Evelyn threw herself into the work with relentless dedication, designing programs, visiting sites, and remembering every name of those she helped. Jonathan supported her fully, not as a benefactor towering above, but as a partner standing beside. The empire he had once sought to expand now became the soil in which her vision took root, and he realized with awe that his wealth had finally found meaning not in accumulation but in transformation. Winter settled over the Mercer estate with a soft white stillness, the once manicured lawns now covered in a blanket of snow, the garden Evelyn had insisted on cultivating asleep beneath the frost. But inside the mansion, the atmosphere glowed with warmth that Jonathan had never known in his years of wealth, a warmth that came not from the roaring fireplaces or the crystal chandeliers, but from the life that now pulsed within its walls, laughter echoing down the hallways, children's voices in rooms once empty, neighbors sharing meals at the long wooden table that Evelyn had chosen to replace the sterile formality of the old one, and every corner filled with evidence of community rather than performance. One wing of the house had become a learning center, where art supplies and donated books filled shelves, and where Evelyn often sat cross-legged on the floor reading aloud to children who clung to her every word, while another wing had been transformed into safe housing for women escaping abuse, the kind of sanctuary Evelyn said she would have wanted for her own mother years ago. And Jonathan, watching her walk through those halls greeting each person by name, realized his mansion was no longer a fortress of isolation but a home of dignity. Their partnership had grown into a rhythm, Jonathan using his business acumen and resources to provide structure while Evelyn used her intuition and compassion to give it soul, and together they founded the Mercer Initiative for Human Dignity, a nonprofit that became known not for glossy galas but for quiet revolutions in forgotten neighborhoods, providing food programs, healthcare access, literacy projects, and safe housing, all designed by Evelyn, all carried out with her relentless humility. She refused interviews, turning down the media's attempts to frame her as a Cinderella fantasy, insisting that the work was not about her, but about the people it touched. And Jonathan followed her lead, ignoring the tabloids and focusing instead on planting what they called seeds of change, one community at a time. Years passed, and their private life grew as deeply as their public mission, and soon a small child's laughter joined theirs, a daughter with wide, curious eyes and a heart that mirrored her mother's, running through the mansion halls that once rang only with silence, clutching picture books as Jonathan sat cross-legged on the rug to read with her while Evelyn hummed softly in the background, her presence turning every ordinary morning into something sacred. The once cold marble floors were now softened with rugs purchased not from elite showrooms but from local artisans. The grand dining room filled not with investors but with neighbors, former employees, children, and women from the shelters who came to share food and companionship. The old study where Jonathan once drowned in solitude now bore marks of partnership, 2 chairs by the fire, 2 sets of books on the shelves, and handwritten notes in Evelyn's delicate script tucked between Jonathan's files, reminders not of deals to be signed but of lives to be touched. Their daughter grew up not with the arrogance of privilege but with the awareness of responsibility, for every night before bed Evelyn told her the same story. The story of a man with everything who gave it all away to find what mattered, and a woman with nothing who gave what little she had and changed the world in the process. And when the girl asked if it was true, Evelyn would smile and whisper, "Yes, baby, it's the truest story I've ever lived," while Jonathan listened from the doorway with tears in his eyes, realizing his empire was not measured in net worth or stock prices, but in the laughter that filled his halls and the dignity that spread outward from his home. As the years turned, Jonathan and Evelyn often sat together on the back porch, wrapped in a shared blanket, sipping chamomile tea under the stars, the once intimidating skyline of the city now just a backdrop to their peace. And Jonathan would tell her, "I used to want to be remembered for building an empire, but now I only want to be remembered for building this life with you." Evelyn would squeeze his hand and reply, "And I used to think I was not allowed to have both love and purpose, but you reminded me I am." And together they would sit in silence, knowing that their legacy was not marble or money, but compassion, humility, and love that asked for nothing and gave everything. The world eventually forgot the scandalous headlines, the whispers about a billionaire and his maid, and instead came to respect the quiet revolution they had sparked. But Jonathan and Evelyn never chased that recognition, because what mattered most to them was not the world's applause, but the authenticity of their own foundation, a foundation built on truth revealed not in words, but in choices. In the final years of Jonathan's life, when the pace of business no longer mattered and his health began to slow, Evelyn remained beside him as she always had, her presence steady, her voice gentle, her love unwavering. And when he passed peacefully with her hand in his, the world called him a titan of industry, a visionary, a philanthropist. But Evelyn knew the truest title he had earned was husband, father, and partner in a story that proved wealth means nothing without dignity and love. She continued the work they had built together, their daughter at her side, carrying the torch of compassion into the next generation, and the mansion that had once been a symbol of isolation remained alive as a shelter, a school, and a sanctuary. Proof that foundations built on sincerity never crumble. The message of their story was clear to all who knew it. True wealth is not in what you keep, but in what you give. And true love is not in what you demand, but in what you nurture. Jonathan Mercer has searched for truth through a test of cards and receipts, and he found it not in vanity or ambition, but in the quiet, selfless heart of Evelyn. And from that discovery grew not just a partnership, but a legacy that transformed emptiness into meaning. The end. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. If it moved you in any way, I'd love for you to support the channel by hitting the like button and subscribing so you don't miss the next story. I'm curious, what did you think about the choices each character made, and how did the ending strike you? Share your thoughts about the plot in the comments, and also let me know where you're watching from. Your perspective adds so much to the conversation, and I can't wait to read what you have to say.